My name is Xiomara Eni Rivera Pagan. I am a doctoral student at Notre Dame of Maryland University, and I will be discussing with you all my conceptual framework focused on the intersection of orientations and ideologies within educational language policies. So, our objectives today will be to discuss language policy orientations and how the language is used to either support or limit linguistic diversity. We're going to differentiate orientations from ideologies, and we're going to discuss language learning ideologies. And we're going to consider a relationship between the educational language policy orientation and the language learning ideologies within your particular educational spaces. So after this session, our goal is to reflect on the position within the conceptual framework according to you as an individual, and then reflect on your school, district, organization's position within the conceptual framework, and then also to consider how we can use this conceptual framework in the future to begin a conversation with decision makers, policy implementers, and leadership within our educational spaces. So, educational language policies, or ELPs, as they'll be identified in today's conversation, we'll start with language policies. So, a language policy is a body of ideas, laws, regulations, rules, and practices intended to achieve the planned language change in the society, group, or system. And this is as identified by Kaplan and Baldoff. And so, language planning and policy, LPP, within schools specifically, or educational learning environments, are educational language policies, or ELPs. And ELPs are especially important because within a school system, those ELPs have the power to determine the access that students have to language, second language acquisition, to home language maintenance, so language or languages, and the curriculum that lead to content and language learning. So within the literature and within the research, sometimes ideologies, the phrase educational language policy ideologies, and orientations are sometimes used interchangeably. For the purposes of this conceptual framework, we're going to be very explicit about separating these two concepts and defining them in order to identify the intersection and how the relationship between different combinations of ideological orientations result in different outcomes for specifically multilingual students. These ideological orientations actually have implications for all students, language majority and language minority students. However, today's conversation, we're really going to make sure to focus on our multilingual students and being purposeful in amplifying ideological orientations that will be most supportive for that particular group. So, ELP ideology we'll discuss further, but we're going to use the belief or the attitude associated with language learning and possibilities for acquiring language as our working definition for ELP ideologies. So, again, focusing on the beliefs and the attitudes either of individuals or institutions. The concept of educational language policy ideologies was first identified by Richard Ruiz, actually in a NABE proposal, an article in 1984, and then Holt and Hornberger, actually years later, use these ideologies as proposed by Ruiz, and they further define them in a analytic tool and a heuristic so that policy implementers can essentially further explore their educational language policies according to the ideologies initially proposed by Ruiz. And so Ruiz gives us three big ideologies that he's identified within history and the literature. The first one that he identifies is language as a problem, and that is the concept that the multilingual resources that our multilingual students are bringing are a problem to be conquered. It's that deficit mindset, and it's a set of values that stem from a monolingual ideal and assimilationist mindset. So that language that students are coming with that is anything other than the dominant language is actually viewed as a problem instead of as a resource. So, in between, language as a right, so that seeks to address linguistically based inequities using compensatory legal mechanisms. And so, this is the use of uh, either policies or legal initiatives in order to support our multilingual students. And it is done so because students have the right to access language. Now, we'll discuss further what that looks like. The language as a right concept is often viewed as language as a right to the dominant language, and so they have access to that English or that dominant language in the United States, it's English. But we also want to consider what Scott Mkangas talks about in terms of language as a right for linguistic minorities in maintaining their home language. So we'll further explore that in the ideological orientations and the conceptual framework. But in this particular proposal, language as a right is essentially seen as seeking compensatory legal mechanisms in order to address these linguistic inequities. Um, the language as a resource ideology further explores multilingualism and cultural diversity, and they're valued and seen as fully compatible with national unity. So, the ability for our students to have a home language and further add through that additive language learning model, it is enhanced by a language as a resource ideology. ELP orientations, instead of the attitudes or beliefs, are at the actual directives or the action oriented initiatives that allow for either a restrictive tolerance, expediency, or promotion orientation for language learning. And so the orientations for educational language policy were initially proposed by Kloss and then further Heinz Kloss, and then further elaborated by Terence Wiley. And so the descriptions were actually from a publication from Heinz Kloss, but the elaborations are from Terence Wiley. And there are three main categories that we explore with the orientation. The first is restrictive, and that's where legal prohibitions or curtailments on the use of minority languages, ideas such as age requirements dictating when a child may study a minority or a foreign language. So we've seen ideas or legal prohibitions such as Proposition 227, in which multilingual students were denied access to multilingual programming, though multilingual programming continued to exist only in spaces for dominant English speakers. And so restrictive practices are really oriented towards English only focus and have the ability to limit the access that our students have to the necessary linguistic skills, resources, tools in order to access second language and especially to maintain first language. The second orientation would be tolerance orientation, and that's a weaker version of the following promotion orientation, but it's not intended to expand the use of minority language. It's typically used for short-term accommodations. And so the idea behind tolerance orientation is that the access to English acquisition is the true focus, and that there is a tolerance orientation, or there are tolerance oriented initiatives that allow space for home language to exist, but are not supporting it, are not making any overt or explicit efforts in order to support home language maintenance. It rather just creates a tolerance atmosphere where it is possible. And the last orientation that Claus explains is the promotion orientation, where the government, the state, the agency allocates resources to support the official use of minority languages. And so the peak of promotion orientation truly supports and amplifies multilingual resources, assets, creates a space in which second language acquisition comes hand in hand with the home language maintenance, not one at the expense of the other. And this can happen in dual language programming, two-way immersion. It can happen in ESOL programming. Really, it's not about the programming. It's more about the initiatives that language instructors, and all teachers are language instructors in that promotion-oriented educational space, that they take towards amplifying the resources that students come with, and also adding on to that additive approach. And this benefits both multilingual students as well as monolingual students, because there is a respect and space in order to practice the multilingual practices or the cultural diversity that is seen within their communities. An expediency orientation is, as mentioned, a lesser version of promotion orientation, in which the goal is uh, really acquiring the English, the dominant language in the United States, English. There's a little bit more space for home language maintenance than you would see in a tolerance orientation. But again, it's very little. The focus, primarily in an expediency orientation, is the acquisition of English. So that might be like a transitional bilingual program that isn't really working to foster the home language throughout the student's educational career. It's not a K to 12 program. It's more so an elementary or a transitional piece, so that the students have a solid base of the home language, but really focus on English acquisition. Promotion above that would really continue the home language maintenance and the second language acquisition throughout the student's career, throughout all students' career. That's that full acquisition promotion orientation. And then the final orientation or note that Claus mentions in terms of explicit policy is that there is null policies. Null policies are the significant absence of policy recognizing minority languages or language varieties. And so often, when there are null policies, there is a lack of consideration for multilingual students. Without the policies in place, the research has shown that language planning and language policy often occurs in spaces where language is a consideration. And the research discusses language as a problem in the way that in language planning, you have to consider the languages that are spoken, languages that are coming in as new languages that are spoken within the community. So if those conversations aren't being had in order to identify how language will be planned, as mentioned initially by Kaplan and Baldoff, then we are not considering how language is going to either be maintained or be shifted within a community. So those conversations about language orientation, about the ideologies of language and language planning are really important in understanding how we most support not only our multilingual students, but all students in creating an environment, an educational environment that really fosters language learning for all. So the conceptual framework takes these two concepts and they intersect them into this framework. And so you'll see that the horizontal axis has the ideologies and the vertical axis has the orientations. And then when they are intersected, then these ideological orientations, or the combination of ideologies and orientations, then create different outcomes for all students. Here we're going to focus on our multilingual students, on our English learning students, on our linguistic minority students. For that additive mindset, we're going to continue to practice identifying them as our multilingual students. And so when you're looking at this conceptual framework, the idea is not necessarily to identify a quadrant in which identifies the ideology and the orientation for yourself or your educational institution. It's more so a spectrum. So you could land either directly on a line, maybe completely within a quadrant, maybe your school system is in one quadrant, but you as a language activist are in a different quadrant. And that's okay. We're using this conceptual framework to just start conversations about ideological orientations and the outcomes for our multilingual students. And so starting with the bottom left-hand corner, problem and restrictive is the most limited and most deficit mindset for language learning and language orientation. So that sees language as a problem and it creates these restrictive oriented educational language policies that limit the opportunities for our multilingual students. If we start to increase the students' access and want them to acquire more English, maybe create a little bit more space for the home language, that's where we start to move up towards promotion orientation, but still are seeing language as a problem where the students have to overcome that first language in order to gain second language acquisition, instead of identifying the resources that our students are coming with. Moving into the right hand side, where resource and restrictive, we are starting to view language as a resource, but we still are not supporting and being mindful of how to amplify the resources that our multilingual students specifically already have, and we're only creating opportunities for those students who already may have access because they speak the dominant language. So the difference between resource and restrictive and resource and promotion would be a very intentional effort and thought and initiative towards supporting our multilingual students as well as our monolingual students, not instead of, but really in order to create these equitable spaces, we have to be mindful, because we have limited resources with the educational system. How do we create more opportunities to capitalize on our students' language abilities, especially our multilingual students who are coming in with such rich language and cultural resources? And right in the middle, we have tolerance, orientation, and language as right. And so we'll further explore all of these ideological orientations, but we understand that this is all a spectrum, and that we can lie anywhere in the spectrum, and that our goal is always just to move towards that upper right-hand quadrant where we're in language as a resource and promotion, because that is going to be the most supportive for our multilingual students, and also for our creating equity with our monolingual students, creating spaces where our monolingual students can eventually also become multilingual students, and also we're promoting dominant language and any other home languages that are apparent within our community and educational spaces. So, as mentioned, the language as a problem and restrictive orientation is language that is viewed through a deficit lens. And opportunities for multilingual students are limited by opportunities through legal prohibitions, lack of resources, or exclusion from participation until English language proficiency is achieved. So, this is that English only movement. The idea that the students need to overcome their home language instead of seeing it as something that can be added onto. So you're restricting their access by creating these policies that maintain uh, the monoglossic idea instead of a heteroglossic idea, where languages can be learned, languages should be learned in tandem. Problem and promotion orientation is that expediency orientation that Klaus mentions, which is languages viewed through a deficit lens, and opportunities for multilingual students are believed to be achieved through assimilationist mindset. So that's that idea that more time on task will support our multilingual students in acquiring that second language. Often the home language is not used as a resource to access the second language. And so the concept is English first, and then if there's space to add on to the home language, which we know often not only limits their access and limits their maintenance of home language, but it doesn't create that bridge so that they can access the second language. So expediency orientation is likely why a lot of our multilingual students are often not capitalizing and advancing in the way that they should be here in the United States. Resource restrictive orientation is where multilingualism is viewed as an enrichment opportunity without consideration for the systemic inequities and how language learning programs are implemented. Who is benefiting from them? So, dual language programming is an excellent form of creating spaces for multilingualism. The seal of biliteracy is an excellent form of amplifying multilingualism, but who is it doing it for? And so when we are implementing these dual language programming or programs, and we are doing so in spaces that are focused on our multilingual or monolingual students, and we have spaces where multilingual students are not being serviced, and we're not capitalizing on the multilingual resources that they already have and using them as our language models, then we're really creating a restrictive oriented educational language policy, either explicitly or implicitly, because we are not using our resources in order to amplify multilingualism. We're really only creating this elite experience in which students who have demonstrated dominant language proficiency are given the access to these resources, and the students who have these resources because their home language is one that can be capitalized on is not being utilized. And so dual language programs that service predominantly monolingual students, or dual language programs that aren't taking into consideration the language of the home language of the students within that particular community, is also something that we need to consider. How are we creating access to these programs sealed by literacy for our multilingual students who have that capacity, they have that linguistic ability, they have that home culture that can really be capitalized in with programs like this? If we're not using them to service our multilingual students, really we're creating a restrictive oriented atmosphere. And resource and promotion orientation, that's where we're really being thoughtful about where we put our programs, who we're servicing with our programs, how we are capitalizing on the resources that our students are already coming with in order to amplify them even further and create access to that new language, new culture, new experience. And so multilingualism and cultural diversity are prioritized throughout programs in an effort to capitalize on the language abilities of linguistic minorities and advance their opportunity through multilingualism. And so a strong consideration of which programs benefit which groups is considered to increase linguistic and cultural equity. So when we're considering these dual language programs, two-way immersion programs, sheltered instruction observation program, the SIOP model, and we're doing so in a way that continues to foster home language and create bridges from home language and culture into that second language and culture in order to create a more rich experience for our multilingual students and our monolingual students. That's where we have the really rich resource promotion orientation. Right in the center, we discussed a little bit, is the language as a right and tolerance orientation. And this is where we're viewing language as a right to access that dominant language. And there is a tolerance towards we're going to give you access for that second language, but not necessarily for maintaining that home language. So this is not what Congress identifies as language as a right for our linguistic minorities, where we're trying to give them access to second language and also foster that home language. That would be right and maybe promotion orientation, which is seen more in terms of theory in the literature and in the research, because there are very few spaces where this is being practiced, the language as a right and promotion orientation. But the right and tolerance is actually quite prevalent, where we have recognized within the United States that our students should be receiving services. We've seen that through Supreme Court legislation. We understand that they should be accessing language. And yet we still haven't been very clear about when we say that this should be accessing language, we understand that they should be accessing that dominant language, but does that also mean that they have a right to maintain the home language? And I believe that we can have both if we just look at it through a promotion and right. But right and tolerance orientation is really just upholding language rights with minimal imposition to local education agencies and state education agencies, leading to really little advancement for the overall equitable access of multilingual students, which we've seen that the programs and the orientations of our educational language policies really need to be pushed further in order to support our multilingual students, because their home language isn't being supported in the way that it needs to, and their second language acquisition also isn't being supported. And we've seen that through the data, right? So how do I do this? What questions should I be asking within my school district and organization in using this conceptual framework? We can start with identifying our explicit policy. What explicit policies do you have that are supporting our multilingual students? And you can locate that on a Board of Education documents. You can locate that by speaking to your school leadership, to your district leadership. Often they have something similar to what the national policy is, just with, or national or the state policy. Sometimes districts are a little bit more explicit in emphasizing what that means in their particular district. And so looking at it and identifying what the orientation would look like according to the definitions that we gave earlier, that would be a great place to start. So in considering the orientation, you really want to look at what languages are amplified and what languages are maybe a little bit more implicit. And so in a policy, this is a policy taken, and you can see that the focus here is really English acquisition, which clearly lets us know that they are definitely focused on either a tolerance orientation or a promotion orientation, but maybe it's language as a right, or language as a problem, because we're not seeing many examples of multilingualism and that language, the home language, is being valued. So the amount that English is being identified versus bilingual or a multilingual educational language policy, when we see that those phrases, that those words are being amplified and being used often, we can see that these spaces are creating opportunities, at least within the explicit policy, for policy implementers to then capitalize on. Now, you would have to do further investigation in order to see, is this the explicit policy, but then the actual ideologies are not demonstrative of that because they're not practicing that? That's a whole nother conversation, and actually what I'm looking into with my dissertation. But it is a good start to have a promotion-oriented policy in which bilingualism, multilingualism, bicultural practices, multicultural practices are being emphasized. So, as we mentioned, all of this comes within the framework that there are top-down and bottom-up processes. There are influences from different scales, different levels of the educational system. And so we also want to keep in mind that within the national, state, district, local level policy, that there are ripple effects. And so there's been a lot of conversation within the research of, should we focus on a top-down approach or a bottom-up approach? And essentially, this conceptual framework gives you the opportunity to look at the holistic picture, to do a local level focus and a national level focus in order to see what pieces of the ideological orientation can be shifted in order to be more progressive towards that promotion and that language as a resource orientation. So paying attention to how language education relates to large-scale linguistic ecosystems like regions, countries, and cities, as well as to small scales like communities, schools, classrooms, and interpersonal interactions, is what is the ecology of language framework. And so being mindful that this conceptual framework is purposefully done so in a way that you can reflect from a large scale to a small scale, from your regions, countries, and cities to your communities, or you as an individual practitioner. So as we mentioned in the examples, what languages are being amplified are a strong consideration of what you would want to think about when you're reflecting on your educational language policy. Are you emphasizing multilingual language learning? Are we emphasizing English language learning? And depending on how you want to move forward, how can you be explicit and intentional in the language that you're using in order to amplify those multilingual resources that your students are already coming in with? So in reflecting, you want to consider some of these questions in order to use the conceptual framework to position yourself or your educational district in such a way that moves them towards that promotion orientation or that language as a resource ideology. So in my school district, how would I categorize the language policy or orientation, considering how much we're talking about either English acquisition only versus multilingual home language maintenance and also second language acquisition? In my school or district, how would I categorize the language learning ideology of the leadership, teachers, support staff? How often are we walking the walk? How often are we actually using phrases to amplify multilingualism? How often are we focusing on home language maintenance? And how often are we valuing these additive practices that these teachers and these support staff are doing in order to maintain the home language for our multilingual students? And what next steps could I take to shift the ideological orientations within my school? A consideration of how you can either address the educational language policies in such a way that amplifies multilingualism and multicultural practices, or how you can begin to demonstrate that you value multilingualism and multicultural practices through everyday instruction, through the valuing of your teachers and your support staff when they are doing practices that are amplifying multilingualism. As well as looking at how that English language acquisition is being advanced. So this conceptual framework can be used, again, it's just a consideration of not which quadrant, what spot you're in, but within the spectrum of ideologies and orientations. You might be on the inside right-hand corner of problem restrictive, or the bottom corner of resource and promotion. So how do you use what you're already doing that's working well for your multilingual students and intentionally support your teachers, staff, and students in moving towards more promotion orientation or language as a resource orientation? Some suggestions that I have in order to do so would be, as I mentioned, to locate your explicit language policy, to evaluate the explicit policy and your own ideological beliefs, your institution's ideological orientation. Sometimes there isn't an explicit language policy in place, and understanding that that policy isn't in place, that there's a null policy, is a great stepping stone so that you begin to have conversation with leadership about how support for your multilingual students and explicit support for your multilingual students will further advance the ability for your teachers, for your leaders, to be able to promote multilingualism instead of relying on each individual to have those support systems or that knowledge in place. If, as an institution, you can create this orientation towards promoting multilingualism, then the policy arbiters and the policy implementers will be able to exert that agency that you want them to in order to support those multilingual practices that we know are in the best interest of all students. If you have an educational language policy already in place, then considering revising them or proposing an educational language policy with promotion orientation, being very explicit about the language that you use in order to create explicit initiatives that support multilingualism, that support multiculturalism, so that your teachers, your support staff, your leaders can then demonstrate value by practicing those initiatives for multilingualism. Support staff in shifting ideology of language learning. Everyone is a language instructor. So we believe that multilingualism is the goal. And if we believe that multilingualism is the goal, it's not just the goal for our students, it's the goal for everyone within our educational system. So showing value for multilingualism and multicultural practices, and supporting our teachers, support staff, and leadership, and practicing that language ideology, language as a resource, helps in not only valuing different languages, but different language variations, and supporting the linguistic repertoire of all of our students to value where they're coming from, their communities, and their culture, and everything that our students are coming with. And then finally, repeat, 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 because this is a spectrum. This is a journey. We are continuing to learn. The research continues to come out that helps to support our multilingual students. And so, as research continues to evolve and give us new ideas of how to support our students through bridging opportunities, translanguaging opportunities, opportunities to use our students as language models. As we continue to acquire that language knowledge, we need to shift our policies. We need to constantly revise our practices, our policies, our ideologies in order to continue to support our multilingual students to the best of our ability. So even today's conceptual framework, it continues to grow. It is a spectrum. We can continue to evolve, and we should continue to evolve if we're hoping to better serve all of our students. So it was a pleasure being with you all today. I hope that you can use this conceptual framework in order to advance the initiatives and the practices and all of the hard work that you all are doing within your local and national and every scale of the educational system. If you use the conceptual framework and would like to share it with me or have any questions, please feel free to reach out. I would love to hear about your experiences, your reflections, any questions that you may have. I'm here at your service. Thank you so much. Again, I am Xiomara Enid Rivera Pagan. I am at Notre Dame of Maryland University. My email is there, and I hope you all have a wonderful day. Adios. Bye.